Thanks everyone for being here. I'm a director here at Hauser and Wirth. I work very closely with the estate of Philip Guston. And we want to thank everyone for being here this evening on the occasion of the new publication by Robert Storr, his brilliant new book, Philip Guston, A Life Spent Painting from Laurence King. We are welcoming you all virtually from Gallery 2 of the first ever virtual only Guston exhibition, which we launched earlier this summer in our online viewing room. The exhibition is called What Endures. It is thoughtfully curated by Musa Mayer, Guston's daughter. We invite you to explore the exhibition, which can be found on our website. But tonight we are here to discuss the major new book, Philip Guston, A Life Spent Painting. We are very pleased to welcome Robert Storr, along with celebrated artist Carroll Dunham, Mark Thomas Gibson, and Amy Sillman. Tonight's discussion will be moderated by artist and critic Alexi Worth, who is on screen as well. This digital event is closed captioned. Should you wish to utilize this function, simply click the closed caption icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The panel will take questions near the end of the event. If you want to submit a question, please do so using the Q&A icon. We here at the gallery want to thank you again for joining us tonight. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of the conversation tonight, Alexi Worth. Thank you.
Thanks, Anders. It's an honor to be here with this fantastic panel. And I'm just going to introduce the panelists one by one, moving alphabetically. We'll start with Carroll Dunham, who is, as I imagine most of you know, one of the most influential and continually surprising artists of his generation. Dunham began his career in the late 70s as an unorthodox abstract painter, and then by a process of reverse evolution that was interestingly different from Guston's, slowly became the unsettling figurative painter that he is today. In addition to his painting, printmaking, sculpting, and teaching, Dunham has an important sideline as a writer. His 2017 collection, Into Words, which I think you can see right behind my head, includes some of the most lucid and bullshitless essays on contemporary art available anywhere. I'm delighted to say that his next US solo show will open at Barbara Gladstone in New York in November. In other words, in just a little over a month and a half. Next, Mark Thomas Gibson is best known for his comics-inflected paintings, prints, drawings, and artist books, which treat contemporary American culture with memorably graphic and sometimes grim irreverence. Hi, Mark.
Hi.
Gibson has had solo exhibitions in Los Angeles, Stockholm, and Tampa, as well as New York, where he's represented by Fredericks and Fraser. In 2016, he co-curated the traveling exhibition Black Pulp. I don't know if you can hear the exclamation point there. And with Will Villalongo. That same year, his first artist book, Some Monsters Loom Large, appeared, followed by a second, Early Retirement, which was acquired by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Gibson is based in Philadelphia, where he teaches at Tyler School of Art and Architecture. He's also represented by M&B Gallery, Los Angeles, and Loyal Gallery, Stockholm. So welcome, Mark. Third, in our alphabetical lineup, Amy Sillman. Amy is an uncategorizable and widely admired painter whose work is based on improvisation. Her mid-career survey show, One Lump or Two, originated at the ICA Boston in 2013. Like Dunham and Gibson, Sillman is also an accomplished art writer and curator. A book of her texts and drawings, hi Amy.
Hi.
Faux Pas has just been published by After Eight Books in Paris. Last fall, she curated the exhibition The Shape of Shape, which was by many accounts, certainly my own, the highlight of MoMA's reopening. Temporarily closed due to COVID-19, the exhibition is now accessible again, and it'll remain on view for another couple weeks. Is that right?
Yep, till October 4th.
Meanwhile, Sillman's next solo show, called Twice Removed, will open just before that closes in the end of September, September 30th, at Gladstone Gallery in New York City. By a weird coincidence, the month before, Dunham's exhibition opens at the same location. Okay, and our last panelist, Rob Storr. Robert Storr's vast resume is a challenge to even the most long-winded introducer, and I'm going to try to be extremely brief. For many years, there he is. Hi, Rob.
Right.
Storr was best known as one of the most discerning critics and then museum curators in the world, mounting thematic exhibitions as well as monographic retrospectives of Elizabeth Murray, Gerhard Richter, Bruce Nauman, and others. After leaving MoMA, Storr organized the celebrated 2003 Site Santa Fe Biennial, and then in 2007 became the first American to curate the Venice Biennale. For more than a decade, Storr was Dean of the Art School at Yale, where he now continues to teach drawing while reserving time for his own painting practice. I taught alongside Storr for some years in Philadelphia, and I want to add that in person, Rob is one of the most encyclopedic-minded, generous, and principled people I've ever heard talk about art. He's an anti-bureaucratic temperament who has mysteriously thrived within bureaucracies and made them work for us. This book, I have to say, isn't his only magnum opus. Check out his Louise Bourgeois Bible, which is, Rob just told us, even heavier than this enormous tome. But this is a magnum opus all the same. And part of the point of this evening is a kind of a baby shower, just to celebrate its appearance. So welcome to all four of you. I'm going to ask some questions and then hopefully mostly get out of the way. But I thought I would begin by asking each of you, and we could, I suppose, just go in the same alphabetical order, to talk a little bit about your history with Guston. I mean, I just to start it, I went to art school at a time when Guston was a kind of oppressive demigod in Boston. And there was a period where I felt like I really had to shut his influence out of my mind in the studio. But this present time obviously has brought it back, both politically and because of this fantastic book and recent exhibitions. And I wondered, beginning with you, Tip, about your own history with his work.
Well, I moved to New York, or started sniffing around the art scene in New York around 1970, right when Guston started exhibiting the work that at that time was so controversial. And I was around a group of older artists who thought a lot of his work up to that point, and then thought what he had done was sort of junk after, you know, when this change happened. So that colored my ability to appreciate his late paintings for a long time. I had him slotted as a kind of precursor to the kind of painting I liked in the 70s, you know, things that kind of evolved out of minimal art. But I had a job in Midtown throughout the 70s, and when he started showing at David McKee Gallery, which was in this the Barbizon Hotel on the Upper East Side, it seemed like he had a show like every 3 months throughout the 1970s. I know that's not true, but I saw all of them, and I, at that point, was trying to shake some of my prejudices or preconceptions, and I started to think a lot more about the paintings as something to take seriously. And I guess it's been just sort of in my mind since then in some way. Certainly an influence at different times, but in funny ways.
Of course, I'm curious to know more about that, but maybe we'll just go around the circle first and go on to Mark about your history with Guston.
It's kind of, I would almost want to say similar, but definitely different a little bit later on. I came to New York like around the 98. And I remember, I think, going into the library at Cooper Union and going through books and kind of trying to figure out like, what am I doing? Why am I here? You know, like kind of thing where you're trying to like find where you might sit inside of all of it. I do remember, looking at a book of Guston and probably seeing like the Klansmen back then and kind of going like, oh, yeah, okay, move on. But then he would always kind of come up again in different times in my life, and I'd see it and I would kind of go like, wait, that's the same guy, like these paintings too? He did these like abstractions, then he did this, and you know, and it was almost like I couldn't draw what happened in what order. But the painting that really did it for me is this one. If you can see, I can't see myself right now at this moment. Gladiator, like these the Gladiators paintings. This one in particular was at MoMA during this ABEX exhibition. And the beginning of it, they were kind of talking about everyone's kind of cribbing, or everyone kind of being interested in Picasso and kind of taking little notes from it. And I remember just seeing this painting in the corner. It's like 24 by 26 or something. And I was like, what is that thing? You know, and it was just like this weird red. And I thought first it was like, okay, this is not a Picasso. It's way too hot. And then I just like gravitated towards it. And just the action, the motion. I love how like you can't see any of the kids' faces. It's just like in play. I mean, there was just so much stuff that it just unpacked for me in that moment. And ever since then, I kind of, I do kind of go back to Guston. And I think what Tippett said about prejudices, like the things that I would think that I wouldn't be interested in at one point, I'll come back and I'll find something new, and it kind of opens up another avenue for me. So yeah, since then I kind of been dibbling-dabbling.
Amy?
Well, I guess I got to New York 5 years after Tip, because you said you came in 70, right? And I was like sort of a mini step later. So I got to New York in 1975, and I came from Chicago, and I came from a world, I didn't study painting or make art in Chicago. I just grew up there and left, but I absorbed the ethos and the aesthetic of non-New York just by being there, because it was the 60s when I grew up, and it was Zap Comics, and it was, Spiegelman, and a lot of things that Rob actually mentions in the book. And of course, Chicago Imagist work, though I wasn't a painter, and the prevalence of the institution, because I went to the Art Institute to look at art, and they have a great collection of, like they have the great de Kooning and stuff, but they also have a fantastic surrealist collection. And they have Florine Stettheimer, and they have others who are not necessarily the mainframe that you see if you grow up in New York. So I already had packed in a kind of otherness sensibility, which I understood, and I did not understand gray blobs and, marks. So, and I did not understand abstraction at all. Inherently, just by nature, I didn't. And so I came to New York, and I became slowly a painter. And as I became a painter, it was already institutionalized. It was the step after Tip said, where like maybe not, but I didn't know any older artists. I didn't know anyone, and I didn't know any artists, and I didn't know older ones. And so the art students then love him universally, or it seemed to me that they did. One person once said, I can't stand him because everyone likes him. And I remember thinking, okay, that's a contrarian. But it was it was more on the line of what you said, Alexi, except for that he wasn't a god. It was still fresh. So it was a perfect time to love him, because it was not hagiographic. He wasn't ascended to an unassailable position. He was a fresh, I literally moved there and started painting, and I moved to New York in 75 and went to art school in 76. And so he was literally making some of the greatest paintings of his life, fully riskily. And I knew also, because I was liked being in radical company or underground or downtown or anti-market, kind of radical type people, young art students, it was made clear to us that he couldn't sell those things. That was what we were told. We were told, like, he made all these great things and he can't sell them because people like abstraction, but the people who want to buy it don't have enough money. I mean, there was this lore that's probably completely wrong, but that was the lore. So he was also positioned as a anti-market person, kind of like on a kind of ethical, it was as though it was an ethical position that we could all agree upon. So the conditions for loving him for me were 100% flipped it out.
And Rob, my memory is, and I'm probably getting this wrong, that your relationship with Guston began with well, not the relationship, but the public part of it began your whole writing career when you protested against a Sheldall takedown.
Yes. Peter Sheldall, who was a friend of mine, was the critic of the Village Voice, and he reviewed the Guston retrospective at the Whitney, and he damned it with faint praise, or maybe not even faint praise. He just damned it. He thought it was uncool. And I had encountered Guston in a variety of situations, not least in Chicago, where for me, Guston was interesting because he was an alternative to the clean, hard edge of Chicago figurative art, Harry Hu and whatever it is, but he had the weirdness. So it was the mixture of a painterliness which was lacking in their work, although I admire them, and a strangeness, a sort of off the beaten track way of thinking about any number of things. Also in this context, I had actually worked for Siqueiros, who was the person for whom Guston had worked. So I had a personal history that went back to his attempts to make political paintings of a certain kind and my attempts to do the same thing. So I had a sense of being inside, outside of many of the categories that ran through his life. And so I found him a sympathetic person to think about, to look at, and then he taught me a lot. I tried, as many people do, to make Gustons for a brief period, and I just couldn't. So it was educational, both in the ways one was led towards it and in the ways one had finally to push back from it. But that didn't interfere with my admiring him continually. And this is the second book that I've written about him, and I have waited 30 years to do it, and I don't regret it at all. And I have been thinking about him constantly since I finished the first one. So that means he's kind of a well that has no bottom for me personally.
Did Siqueiros remember Guston?
No, because I wasn't aware of Guston when I was working for Siqueiros. He did remember Pollock, who, as people probably know, was Guston's high school classmate. And these two major artists were met Siqueiros in Los Angeles. Guston dropped out of school. Pollock, dropped out and then went right back. Guston dropped out of school, went to Mexico, and tried to make murals in Mexico.
I didn't know until reading your book that they were kicked out of school together. Is that right?
They did a satire. I think it was of the high school, sports team or something like that. The kind of stuff that young people do. Pollock went back, and Guston just said, "No, that's it. I'm out." Guston was extraordinarily skillful, and he'd had good mentors in Los Angeles before and after he had that episode, and he could draw. He could draw really, really, really well in the classical academic way, influenced by De Chirico, influenced by magic realism, and so on. So he had a leg up on Pollock, who couldn't draw for beans in that way. He could draw wonderful things in other ways that he invented, but Pollock was a kind of inarticulate young artist when he was young.
Yes, that's certainly true. There's some beautiful, like that life drawing self-portrait that scrolled through in the images we saw before the panel started. You see right away that he has the hand that could do whatever he needed to do.
Yeah.
I'm curious, drawing, one way to think, there's a beautiful section of the book where you reproduce a Guston talk about drawings, full of images. It's like watching Guston perform a slide talk. But it makes me think of the comics angle on drawing, which I think is important to all of the panelists. And yet in the comics world, which was partly how I came to Guston, there was a certain amount of doubt. People looked at, and Rob, you cover this in the book, people thought about the early 70s Gustons in terms of crumb, and some comics people often were a little skeptical or disparaging. And I wondered, Mark, I think of you as being a comics person especially, but everyone is. Did you have some of those feelings? How did you feel about Guston in relationship to comics?
For me, I was happy to see it. I was happy to see that there was someone who had crossed the line. I always think that it's so ridiculous that there's all these weird lines and barriers and rules that people kind of create about how to make or what you need to make or how's it going to come out. And I remember there in art school, definitely there was a line of like, oh, that's too comic booky, or that looks too goofy, or this looks like that, or that's not proportioned right. And it was more like just a shut down kind of thing before you even start to open up your brain to think about what the person's actually trying to articulate. Like I thought like in that part, in that back part, when he's talking about drawing and he's talking about his friend who sees the figures and kind of calls like him out as a character. And then he starts to talk about them as this kind of patchwork Klansmen. And then he starts talking about the Golem. And then he starts talking about like Frankenstein. And I started thinking about like Frankensteining or Goleming a world instead of just like the individual, and kind of like that piecing together. But it almost like not as a separate thing, but almost like as a parallel world. And I think that's like something that comics or even people who are into all that kind of stuff, because I think Rob does a good job of talking about the fact that all of them kind of came from a similar place. All of them were looking back at the same references. And it's about like, when you look at those references, at some point you take them into yourself and then you work them out and you think about what they do and you take the best parts you can get and then you make something of it of your own. It's like, that's sort of the fun of it. I think when people get weird about like who grandfathered who and who made what, you know, it's like everyone starts questioning who's their maker or something. And then that breaks it all down. That's simplistic, you know, it doesn't go anywhere, it can't grow. So that's what I love about Guston.
I can tell you one thing about that. The bad rap on Guston was that he was slumming. And that's what Hilton Kramer, who was the critic of the New York Times, said of him. And that's what a lot of people believed about him. Then within the comics world, the people who were doing that kind of work, which was looking back at George Harriman and early comics, newspaper comics, thought he was a Johnny-come-lately. The point was that he learned to draw by hiding in a room in his house in Los Angeles as a kid, and he copied the Sunday comics when they came in the newspaper. So he was there at the beginning, and he was not from outside, he was from way inside, also doing those old comics when they were fresh off the press.
I love that story that you tell about him in a closet with a dangling light bulb. Like
Yeah.
The Night Studio was there in the 1920s.
Yes.
I think also it's important, you know, Guston certainly an important part of it, but this move, this collapse of the boundaries of drawing styles between comics and so-called fine art is a big part of modernism. I mean, it goes way back, and they're all different kinds of manifestations of it. I mean, Roy Lichtenstein is a manifestation of it, which couldn't be more different than what Guston developed into. And I adore comics. I look at them, I read about them all the time. I'm nuts about that kind of stuff. But I also think it's important to acknowledge that there's a different intention behind painting than there is behind making a comic. I mean, not in any kind of hierarchical or value judgment kind of way, but just as the kind of thing you're putting in the world and the way that it comes about. You know, in Guston's case, all through his life, you can see him finding the next thing in the act of making something. You know, it's found through drawing, it's found through painting, it's in the material. Those Klansmen and all that stuff almost seem to bubble up like from a lava lamp out of, the paint from paintings from 10 years before. So the comic thing is very important, but it's not the ultimate, to me, not ultimately the frame for thinking about him, because his ambitions were very grandiose. I mean, in a good way.
I think comic people can be pretty grandiose in what they want to do with it. I think like the comic book part for me, like when I look at it, and especially when talking about how sometimes these things are misread, and if you don't understand the source material, like the legs hanging off and the pratfall and the image, then people like take other elements of his biography, other elements of his identity, and they start to use that as a way to define that. Then it becomes about the Holocaust, and where it may had images and it may have references to the Holocaust was possibly a thought that he was working through, but it also, you can look at it and you can see the direct like pulls or from other comic book sources, that it's just, it's not really, and that's what I mean, that in this case, I don't know if it's just in either or, really, you know. I mean, there's definitely painting problems there, and there's definitely painting thinking happening there. But I think it's like I think that's another weird thing about this book I keep thinking about, is that you kind of like left it where it is. You kind of left it with him, like as in, like, you didn't try to add on a bunch of extra stuff to who he was, like after he passed away. It was really more like, this is who he was. This is what he was. This is what he did. Like, he never said certain things. He never said certain other things. You know, he did say this. Like, I love that part of the book. It just kind of kept it with him.
I feel like the thing about the comic is very important in terms of its ambiguity in relation to the tragic, which is maybe sort of what you're both saying. But I mean, like, you know, a lot of the thing that I liked about the book was about really illuminating this tension, this question of tension in his structural working method and his language, because it's all terrible stuff. It's the Holocaust and Klansmen. I mean, those are fascists and murderers, you know, and Richard Nixon, and, you know, all kinds of other horrible things like dying and being lonely and being, you know, being in a void, and et cetera, et cetera. And so there's nothing comic really about it. And that's also very existential. It's also very Jewish. It's also very, it's very much a part of Yiddishkeit, which you sort of bring up. And I was actually going to ask Rob about this thing. It's funny because you mentioned, there's a really short mention about, because I was thinking, well, Peter Saul was making comic paintings, but he's really making comic paintings as opposed to Guston, to me. And, you know, they're more grotesque and they're more horrible, you know, kind of way of comic, where I feel like Guston is more Beckett and more miserable and more Death of a Salesman and more, you know, Sartre and, you know, kind of misery and stuff. But like you say that there's a mention in there somewhere where like he also gets dissed by Peter Saul, who's like, it's not gnarly enough or something.
Well, you know, Peter is a friend and I respect him a great deal. That's not, the problem is not his, but it is this tendency to classify and be exclusive rather than to classify and amalgamate and differentiate at the same time. You know, Peter is not Jewish, for one thing, so he may not know what Yiddishkeit is. He may not know what these mixed messages and these ambivalent feelings are, in fact. It's also what comics are and what caricature is. Caricature essentializes things, reduces them to very, very basic equations, and then you run changes on them. A good caricaturist is. And that's a dangerous enterprise, but it's also a wonderfully rich one. So once you've found a vocabulary of form, you can do all kinds of things with it. You can make people laugh with it. And there are paintings in this book that have not been shown before, where dogs fly out the window and so on and so forth, which are funny. They're outright laugh aloud funny. And there are other ones where it's made with the same vocabulary, which are gut-wrenching. And I think Guston understood what the range was within the idiom that he'd chosen, and he tended to be on the dark side, but he could allow himself a good laugh from time to time. So I think that's important as well. And I think it's in the sensibility of the viewer that these things get separated again and categorically juxtaposed or pitted against each other. Let's just say they don't, you know, they are not mutually canceling. They're all bound together.
And that's part of the tragic comic part, I would say.
Yeah.
And Rob, you write about the grotesque in some of these passages as a way to think helpfully about that's less binary about these issues. Yeah.
And the grotesque is something that brings us back to the Renaissance. I mean, Guston was deeply, deeply steeped in Renaissance art. He made very beautiful paintings that were as meticulous as anything made by a Renaissance old master. And he lived in Rome for a while, and he looked at a lot of this stuff. And Rome is full of caricature and grotesquerie everywhere you look. That there's a frame around a Raphael painting painted by Raphael where there are monsters, but the internal image is classical as it can possibly be. And the coexistence of those two things by the same hand is something that Guston fully understood and that we have the problem with, but not him and not Raphael.
Yeah, I was surprised a little bit by how often Italy, Rome specifically, comes up in the book, and how important it was for him, not just Piero, but it being in Italy.
Yeah.
And he was there at formative times, right?
Well, he went there at the end of his sort of Midwestern period, and he won the Prix de Rome, and he found himself again as an artist while being there. He made some of his first abstract paintings there, or at least did the trial runs for them. And then again, he went after his very bad experience with the show that was the David McKee, which launched the new Guston, or the next installment of the new Guston. And also he was, through Loyster Feidelson and his teachers in Los Angeles, he just spent a lot of time looking at Renaissance art. He knew it backwards and forwards. And I think all of that together was a bedrock for him, but it gave him a wide field of operation. Where many people look to the Renaissance for eternal verities, he looked at it for eternal contradictions and found them.
That's needs unpacking, I think. Eternal contradictions. I guess I think of him as in my own mind, I was like thinking that what he found in Italy was a kind of conceptual schematic drawing that's very Italian versus Northern. But what you're saying is something totally different.
It's an existential, spiritual, philosophical orientation. You know, the literature of the Renaissance is full of tragicomedy, right? And the imagery of the Renaissance is full of tragicomedy. And he was that kind of a man. He had a sense of the earthy absurdity of reality. And he also had a sense of the terribleness of what we live in. I mean, right now is a Gustonian time, if ever there was one. And many people have asked me, what do I think Guston would have done as an artist or as a caricaturist under present circumstances? And all I can say, I wouldn't want to bring anybody back for this, but if I wanted to bring one person back for this, it would be him.
And Tip, you and I were talking about exactly that earlier, about the incredible timing in some ways of this book and of thinking about Guston now.
Well, I certainly see, I suppose particularly the images, the paintings with images of the Klansmen in them, which I've been interested in. I crossed over into loving them many, many years ago. And I've thought about them a lot. And I think in the last 6 months, I've seen them differently than I ever did before. It hadn't hit me quite so much the extent to which he was implicating himself as, you know, Mr. White Painter Man in this history. And it really crosses with a lot, it overlaps with a lot of things that this one anyway, is feeling about our times, you know, the situation we find ourselves in, trying to understand one's own part in it. And so that took me back to thinking about how, I don't mean clever in a superficial way, but how deeply clever his relationship to subject matter was. Because, you know, that's a tricky thing to do, to make an interesting and amusing painting of yourself as a racist monster who also paints. You know, that's a complex thing. And we wouldn't even care about it at all if it weren't painted in a way that's interesting to us now. So it's a fascinating cluster of features that I think feels very rich right now to think about.
I think Tip is right on the money so far as the currency of these paintings is because he doesn't run away from complicity in what he's painting. He's there for it, and he knows it will pull him under whether or not he admits it. He also at one point confessed to have some sympathy, not sympathy, some degree of identification with Richard Nixon, because they both came from lower middle class neighborhoods in the same part of California at the same time. And the ability to see in your adversary, your enemy, or the person anyway who's chosen to make themselves your enemy, a part of yourself allows you to do a more thorough examination of that villain and to present that villain in a way which is more complete, you know. And it makes him no less villainous, but does allow a way in. So it's not just a caricature evil, it is the evil in us.
It's also a refreshingly not sort of virtue signaling move. It's very evolved in terms of being open and vulnerable to a certain kind of misunderstanding.
Yeah. It also collapses time in useful ways because Robert Hughes reviewed Guston favorably. He liked him, but he said that he thought that the inclusion of the Klan was an anachronism. Well, first of all, it wasn't, because the Klan was very active at that time and had been. Klan members had bombed the church in Birmingham where the schoolgirls were killed. The Klan was not a thing of the past. It wasn't left behind in old photographs. It was real, and we know it's real now.
Yes, it's startling to come across your quotation from Hughes in the book, that it just, it's bitter.
It's bitter.
I was thinking about what you had said when we were talking about like how long it took for you to make this book. And but I almost would say that he's coming at the perfect time, because there's so many things that you do where you kind of talk about tragedies that occurred that we think that were so long ago, but they were not even resolved today, or they're had just recently been resolved, you know, with some of the people actually being, you know, brought to justice who committed these crimes, who were Klansmen. But I totally agree with what Tip was saying about the work and about the Klansmen, because I mean, in my first encounter with it, I was like, I don't know about this. This is strange. This is somebody trying to get away with something. And then, you know, as I kind of got older and I read more about Guston and I got to see the work from his 17-year-old guy making these paintings, you know, it's like how idyllic, you know, I mean, our idealism of like a 17-year-old person kind of calling out, you know, saying like, this is wrong. This is racism. This is like evil. And to become an older man and then kind of live a life and to kind of see his own part in some of that, or to even think of himself as that. But what I also love about those paintings and how that conspiratorial nature of them, that the grouping of them, that either he's seeing himself, painting himself, but there's always another one around. Like they need each other to kind of complete the circuit of like, of that's how the evil works. It's a kind of like everyone's under a hood, but everyone's doing something nefarious. And it's an interesting way to even possibly talk about whiteness and like this kind of acknowledged space that someone holds inside of a society and how they kind of team around. That painting, there's this one painting in there, my thing is off, but it's called Caught, with the two Klansmen and the giant hand coming down. And I've never seen that painting anywhere. And I just like that moment of where that hand is, that almost like Mickey Mouse hand with the little lines on it. And it's just this kind of like gesture. It's like I would have loved to hear him speak about that. I mean, I don't know how he would have really impacted, but I just kind of curious as that moment of like the need to be outside of those characters for once and to kind of say like, I see you, like I see this as a thing.
I mean, I feel like all of the thing you're describing is very connected to, I don't want to simplify it at all or bring it back to Yiddishkeit, you know, unnecessarily, but there is a very definite connection to being a post-war Jew, you know, in America. And also that you explain that his father was a junk man, you know, like a character, like right out of, you know, not even more than Death of a Salesman, because it's a working class man. And, you know, so, I mean, there's this thing that's also about, you know, implicating yourself, understanding your double position because you're white, you're a male, you know, you're, privileged in a sense, you know, and you're also at the same time, you know, a working class Jewish guy, you know, and I guess I feel like literally the last time I went to a panel, funnily enough, it was people talking about Mike Kelly. And, you know, they were examining the people on the panel. I wasn't on it, I was listening. And it was like a black panelist and a white panelist talking about Mike Kelly as like a white working class man. And the black woman panelist, Colleen Smith, was saying he's never examined, you know, as a working class white man. You know, his whiteness is never examined. And so in a weird way, I feel like it's interesting to me to think about, you know, the whiteness of Guston, which isn't very clear in a weird way when you're a person right after World War II. You know, and your father is a junk man and he died or took his life. And, you know, it's like there's a slight complication at the edges, and it's going to make you very ambiguous because your family just was in mortal danger, and you're going to understand that and be sensitive. Plus he studies with Siqueiros. He's a communist. He's, you know, for the working man. You know, when he starts, he's super political. And I think that dual vision, that dual up and down, high and low, in and out, that's a very particular position of a person who has a relationship to immigration, let's say.
Yeah, lest we forget, the Klan was wildly anti-Semitic, okay?
I didn't hear what you said.
The Klan was wildly anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
And he was a very literate man, and he had read the stories of Isaac Babel about the Cossacks who were brought into the Revolutionary Army after the revolution, but had previously been the scourge of the Jewish community in the shtetl. And so Isaac Babel, as a writer, as a Jewish writer, embedded with the Cossacks who would have gladly slaughtered him 2 or 3 years before, that is the situation that he saw for himself. Gus was a very literate man. And so the Klan paintings are in certain ways Babel paintings. They're Cossack paintings as well as they're about what it's like to be in and amongst the people who would like you dead. You know?
That's lovely.
I'm interested in the way that Amy and Mark are both connecting the early and late Klan paintings in a way that suggests the continuity of Guston's career. The flip side of it is to see, and I think maybe this is a kind of conventional current way of looking at Guston, to really make late Guston Guston, to de-emphasize the abstract expressionist and early work, to, you know, give it some admiration, but fundamentally root your thinking. And I feel like I'm an example. I've come, and the book actually did confirm this for me. It made me think that really the Guston I care about is only Guston after 70 or 60, you know, maybe the mid 60s. And I wonder, it sounds to me like at least you two have a kind of different view and are really more genuinely interested. But would it be fair to say that, for instance, the early 50s paintings, which were so epical, seemed like they were the high point of the career, are really now kind of out of whack with our present day interests?
I mean, I'm interested in them in the book, but how they kind of possibly came about. I mean, what I took from the book was that he ends up going to Italy and actually seeing the works that he'd been like studying, you know, in some form. And then almost, I mean, this is what I'm kind of taking from it, is that he saw his difference from it. Like he saw like his difference in, like, he already has a certain type of hand in the way that, especially where he was applying paint at that period of time. And to see those paintings in person, I'd almost would imagine that it kind of caused like like some sense of rupture. And instead of trying harder to connect himself to that work, it was almost like he was just like kind of left with his touch and left with his hand, and then just kind of started doubling down on that, like started trying to like work through that and understand through that, like where paint just was significant in the act of using the paint, is what I started to see. And I thought I was very interested in that part of it.
I mean, to be really honest, I don't really make a big distinction between all of it, because for me, those homeless abstractions or homeless figurations or whatever they're called, they contain tragedy. You know, Mark, that scissors, it's so appropriate. No, it's just funny that you're like, you picked up a weapon just to talk about these weaponized paintings.
You know, something was going on in those paintings, you know.
But no, take it.
Oh yes, Amy.
This one too. But I feel like I just feel like for me, the struggle of the unknown, the comedy, the tragedy, the clunkiness, the inside, outside, there's an incredible quote. I can even quote it. My favorite quote of the book is where Guston says, painting becomes a tug of war between what you know and what you don't know, between the moment and the pull of memory. It crosses the narrow bridge from diagramming to that other state, corporeality. And I just feel like he's on this bridge that's made of like, there's an abyss under it, clearly. And, you know, you know, he's walking the plank. And in those abstract paints, for me, he's doing the same thing. Of course, it's not self-implicative. It's not clearly identificatory. You know, he's not a Klansman or a Stumblebum, or, you know, he's not putting himself in that clear, nameable position. But that fog of not knowing, that misery, that existential crisis, all of that, like, I mean, I totally think of that as suffused with all of the struggles we're talking about.
Well,
Yeah, sorry, Rob, go.
I've had the privilege of being a museum curator with a great collection at MoMA, and I can think of, you know, doing a lot of different combinations of Guston's work from the 50s with Mondrian, who partly inspired them, with works by other artists influenced by John Cage, because he was, who were later, and then moving over Guston and Jasper Johns, then moving over Guston and other people. Guston was a complete artist. He had all the range that he wanted, and he focused in certain ways during certain periods, and he came to the end of some explorations, but we have the paintings. He made moves on beyond that, but we have the paintings. And if you do take a Guston of the 50s and put it up against, say, a Robert Ryman, or a Guston of a certain period and put it up against Johns, or a Guston of a certain period and putting up against a Chirico, these are not matters of influence, they're matters of correlation. And it's like seeing the differences among things that are similar in certain qualities and radically other in other qualities. And I think that's the great thing. He is the complete artist. There's no other abstract expressionist who produced as many bodies of resolved work as he did.
I think in a minute we'll start taking questions from the audience. But I was curious, Tip, to hear your thoughts about that, about the continuity or the sense of how this career is centered for you.
Well, as I said at the beginning, I started my personal art history research. You know, as a young artist, I started trying to learn about abstraction, and particularly post-war abstraction in New York. And Guston was this, you know, key central figure in that, and was interesting to me for that reason. I don't think so much anymore. I mean, it was kind of I drank the Kool-Aid thing a bit, the way a lot of us felt about this emptying out of painting. I mean, Rob mentioned Ryman or Robert Mangold, Agnes Martin. These were all people that were what Joe Baer was doing. There was all this stuff was what my friends and I were very interested in, and Guston was part of the genealogy that led up to that. But I think my idea about painting's function for me and in the world, and the whole way that the culture is, and the way everything feels has changed so much. It can be hard for me now to hold on to my enthusiasm for that stuff in the face of subjects. So I have to say, I know that none of us would care about late Guston if the things weren't made in the particular way that they are. And I think that he had to do everything he did up to then in order to be able to do it. You know, you see the subject matter in the early work, and you see the interest in facture and materiality in the middle period. And then it all seems to kind of just come together and go. And it seems like he produced all that stuff in the space of a very short period of time and relative to a life. And so that's where, for me, that's where the contradiction really is. You know, the idea that he was such a serious person and obviously motivated by such earnest, you know, such an earnest critique of the culture he was operating in, But at the same time, he was super ambitious within this very small scene that he was part of. And out of it, we get these terrific paintings. But I guess, to be perfectly honest, I don't think much about anything he did anymore before the late 60s.
I feel like that I just look at those paintings of the awkward period between the high, beautiful pink thatches and the beginning of the real, emergence of the small emblems, like Roman trees and stuff. There's that period, that amazing, totally amazing period where it's chunky and it's the clock in those kind of paintings with the chunks and weird. I love those so much. I feel like they are so blind and discomforting. And if the subject is that unclear, it feels totally anguished. And I feel that they're like Goya's in a weird way, like, except for that they're in weird candy colors instead of dark tones. And I read them as exactly as searching and tragicomic as anything else. But I guess I just don't make a huge distinction between, obviously I can see the difference, but the narration and stuff, but like, I look at it again at this book and I through it and I was still utterly, totally moved by those fragments, those just shards of mesmerizing unfinishedness, just hanging in space. I love them. They're so weird and ugly and uncomfortable.
Well, it's wonderful to be able to track the thinking in the paintings that way.
But you know what? I also see them as highly Jewish because that's the time where he's still best friends with Morton Feldman. And Morton Feldman's going around being his big best friend until he dumps him for stopping being abstract. And then he goes on to to Philip Roth. He goes on to Philip Roth, his other Jewish friend, and they're driving around, and I love the thing that they said they were looking for American crumminess. But I was fascinated. My favorite part of the book was where you dump your old best friend, or your old best friend dumps you for stopping being abstract. And then your new best friend likes it that you tell stories, but both of them have relationships that explain that same identity that we were describing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to start taking a few questions from the audience because there's some fun ones. Several people asked if we would show the book, so I'll hold it up. Several other people are asked about Guston's relationship to food, and I'm looking for some food pictures.
I have one question. Can I ask Rob? There's this painting that I love so much that is one of my favorite Gustons of all time. And it's of a pastrami sandwich and then a telephone, and it's called Anxiety, and it's not in the book. And I was just wondering.
I don't remember I had a much longer list of images than we could possibly reproduce. And I think that was in one of our iterations, because I know the painting you're talking about. But one can't do everything. So somebody will do a supplementary volume, or the catalog raisonné, which Sally Raddick is doing, will have all of that material in it. But anyway, it's on its way. But he was enormously prolific. He worked very slowly for the first half of his life, partly because the very early ones were lots of fine handwork. The second ones were lots of anguish. But by the time the floodgates opened, they really opened wide up. And the number of works per year is staggering. So we'll get it someday.
A couple of I'm just scrolling through the questions, people asked about his palette, which is so distinctive, about the reds, the pinks, and the connection to Italy, I think, comes up there too. Any thoughts about about color and Guston?
I defer to my.
I always had a thing that I felt like he was the person who just made me understand that pink was the color of death and misery because of that period Mark is talking about. Because even in the earlier, these tragic scenes of struggle, he's painting these pink colors that later come back, and I always thought pink for Guston must be some kind of death color.
Yeah, I mean, what is it? He says that about like pink. He says that he will get like cadmium red and he would get like titanium white. And that's almost like where he would always start. Like anytime when he thought like paint wasn't going to do anything else for him or he kind of got jammed up, he would just make a big pile of pink. And then as he would start pushing the pink, he would stop thinking about whatever the block was or like start thinking about what it needed to be. And then started making the painting and becoming whatever it wanted to become. You know, the subject would find itself some maybe along the way. So yeah, pink is I mean, I think there's some for everyone. There has like a trigger color maybe. I don't know. For me, it's black, but I don't know. Everyone has something that starts it off.
A trigger color.
You know.
When I was all through the 70s, when I was going to see a lot of his exhibitions, I sort of gradually realized that there was a range of color that seemed to always be there. And since he wasn't in any way attempting to mimic nature, it seemed like these particular colors helped him make the world of his paintings, which, I mean, he referred to when he talked about his paintings as something that in some sense pre-existed the painting and that he revealed it in the act of painting. And which is a sentiment I relate to a lot myself. And the idea that limitations give you freedom is an idea that appeals to me very much. And I think I took that away from the relationship of the palette to the subjects and the handling in these paintings.
Cadmium red is one of the most expensive colors you can buy, which I hadn't thought about. You know, there's Frank Stella talks about being given free cadmium red at Andover as a kind of luxury and wasting it. But to me, there's a sort of a paradox between the kind of impoverished quality of this depicted circumstances and all this cadmium.
Well, I think that he didn't use the highest quality paints. Or let's put it this way, he did in fact have a relation with Leonard Beaucourt, who supplied artists with paints and gave them a good price and so on. So he could get a lot of cadmium paint for a relatively small price. But there's a wonderful story he tells about having watched Stuart Davis painting in a studio provided to the both of them by the WPA. And he's in the studio and he's using little brushes and he's trying to get fine shadings and he's eking out a painting with small blobs of paint. And he sees Davis in the next room doing these great, big, heavily, richly painted things, changing his mind about the painting and scraping all of it onto the floor. Now, that was in the Depression when cadmium was really an expensive thing. So I think, you know, it's a matter of your attitude, your materials are there in order for you to work. You don't not do things because you can't afford to. You find something else.
Well, that's also something he said at one point where they're talking about like how he sold some paintings and he finally had the money to make the paintings he wanted, right? And I think about that a lot. You know, like when you actually kind of get the material right and the enough of it to just sort of work out all the other stuff that needs to actually be done.
Well, his friend de Kooning did black and white enamel paintings because enamel was cheaper, right? Picasso did blue paintings because blue was cheaper. This has happened before, but the point is that once you commit, you can't stint. You have to really let it go and see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question about the very late work, which Rob, you show a number of examples of the bolder paintings that I guess are right up near the time of his second heart attack. And I hadn't seen some of those before. They seem like they're Sisyphus pictures almost explicitly. I could hold some of those up for the audience and we could look at them. There's this kind of mountainside here, and then there's a couple more, these two, which kind of end the painting section of the book.
Yep. Well, I think they are. There's also the one on the left there is related to the Colima heads that he saw in Mexico, where these gigantic boulders that were carved by pre-Columbian civilizations and moved through the jungle. Nobody knows quite how. So there are a number of precedents, but I think the Sisyphusian idea is the one that is poetically operating. And it's interesting too that he had in the late 60s, mid to late 60s, he had a lot of paintings with the great big black blocks of color floating in space, right? They're levitating. So by the time he gets to the end of his life, they're on the ground and they're barely moving anywhere. So he'd sort of been grounded, having already imagined situations of great weight and mass, but somehow or they're magically alive.
Somebody asked, could you talk a bit more about the relationship between the awkwardness in Guston's forms and your own awkwardness? I thought that was maybe interesting. Anybody want to pick that one up?
Give me
I
that
guess not personal, but artistic awkwardness, presumably.
I don't know what kind of awkwardness they're speaking about, but I never had the facility that Guston had, so I'm off the hook. I don't have to prove that I don't have it. Guston was in a double bind because he really liked de Kooning, could do anything. And so I think his awkwardness is not affected, but it's something that he had to harness, something he had to find and then harness.
But that makes sense because that makes sense in terms of the cartoon situation. Because I mean, the real grappling with something that's supposed to be kind of vulgar, or that comes from an earlier moment when you're younger and you're awkward. Because I feel like it's like his way of being great at something, but also trying to make it as hard as possible for himself. To he's always got like, I feel like this kind of, not always, because he also goes riffs a lot in where he's really good at the thing and makes a lot of work in an area of expertise in each phase. But at the same time, I feel like he makes things as hard as he can for himself a lot of the time, it seems like. And so the awkwardness, I think, is like a thing of literally trying to tie one hand behind your back and see if you can make an amazing painting with a kind of, it's almost like what would be a limited palette, but it's like a limited field of operation that you then blow all the walls out. I mean, but I feel like that's what, like when he has all those paintings of paws, I mean literally like your hand as a paw and these veiny stumps. Yeah. Like it's like he's literally making this picture of the most horrible stump of a paw that is so unwieldy. It's not, there's everything, nothing about it is what we would call facile or skillful. And then it's clear that he wants to go there, like to become a bear or something.
Scale too. I mean, those things are like 10 feet long, some of them, you know, like they're massive, big paintings. And also like kind of thinking as he gets later on in his life and thinking about the Sisyphusian like boulder up the hill, it's like, that was kind of, and like he can't even paint with oil anymore. He's painting with acrylic. Like he's like, all these things are starting to like come down on him. And he's still like trying to push it out as much as he can. He's still trying to get out what he can. Just like even thinking that the scale gets to a point where it's like under 5 feet, you know, but he's still like making it have weight. He's still making it have that kind of power, that heaviness. I don't even thought about it as clunkiness. I always thought like, or if it was clunky, it was always clunky to be like, to show weight or to show like gravity or to show like that it sits in the world. It's like another way of like kind of making it real, kind of going back to that Gollum thing, you know, like saying that these things are physical.
You know what I never really thought of before this conversation, though? He doesn't really deal with gender the way he does with the Klan. Like, it's not like women are these interesting sites of exploration at all. There isn't any of that because he is this big hulking man who smokes and rides around and has paw-like fingers and he's giant. Clearly he's much bigger than Musa or anyone else. And the women, if you do think about it, I mean, just to be, you know, devil's advocate for a second, I mean, I love the guy, but like he doesn't do like that much with like any kind of examination of critical gender situations at all. There's just always this nice lady on the horizon.
Well,
or he's like in the place of her, like kind of like in bed where he's there and she's just like a little glimpse of her, you know, peeking through. Yeah.
But what he doesn't do, and what is, I think, unnoticed, is he does not make himself the heroic artist. He's an anti-heroic artist. He's a not, particularly good-looking, not particularly amiable. He's a big problematic lump, and that is the opposite of the myth of the macho artist of the 1950s. And I think he's the only artist of his generation to have gone there.
To have gone to the big amiable lump?
No, not amiable, not so amiable.
Oh,
Not necessarily the lump to find yourself in bed with.
These are some of the paintings that are, I think, Rob, you say, of the two muses, right?
Yep.
Potentially.
Yep.
Daughter and mother, daughter and wife.
He loved Musa very much. It was an awkward marriage in many ways. Many marriages are. And he tried to portray his affection and his flawedness. He was an alcoholic. He chain smoked. He had the ego that artists have. He was a handful. And he tried to portray himself as such, not as a heroic figure at all.
right. But that is the part where I'm saying there's a kind of a little space there that you can say, like, well, I guess he didn't deal with this part, because the woman character is not fleshed out. It's all about him.
I'm not sure it's all about him. I think it is mostly about him, and he recognizes that his self-centeredness has cost this figure in his life a great deal. I mean, the images of the two of them in bed don't do him any favors.
That's one of my favorites, I have to say. This image.
Yeah.
This kind of apart couple.
I'm not saying he was a woke feminist by any stretch. He was aware of how much of a handful he was, and he was aware of Musa as being with him and having stayed with him, and he shows affection for her in the way he paints her. The one of the two of them sort of riding in the sea at night is a very, very affectionate painting. It is.
Well, yeah, there's loads of affection. I'm just saying there's not there's neither a lady with like a rolling pin in her hand, nor is there like an actual female person who's anything other than affection. I'm not getting on the guy for it, but I'm just saying, if you do think about that sort of self-implicatory thing, like he does somewhat examine the vicissitudes of male characters and racial characters, and not really the other things are left aside.
It's like I was wondering if that's just because maybe that was some I mean, it's a pretty painful part of a relationship to kind of portray that you're distant from your partner, to portray that, like, you have a child with this person, you've lived with this person, and like you're showing large scale figurative paintings of where this person has their back turned to you at night, like like I think those are the points when it's maybe the paintings are about what the subject is, not like in the same way a comic or a cartoon would maybe show like her as an angry wife or her as a problem, but he's the problem, like maybe he sees himself in this, and I mean this is going maybe too far, but maybe he sees himself in this as the problem, as not the it's like they're fine, they're healthy, he's unhealthy.
Yeah, no doubt. I agree with you. I just am sort of observing it for the first time in my own imagination, like where the narrative goes and where the narrative doesn't go. He's a friendly golem like lump with a big paw who's always there and always misses. The misses is kind of there too.
Yeah, no, but I think that's like, I mean, it's interesting in a way, like that's like he could lie, he could lie, and that would tell us also another thing about him in a way.
He certainly painted no pictures that are the equivalent of Lucian Freud's painting of himself with a model clinging adoringly to his leg. That never happened.
He also didn't. But he didn't paint what Tip paints either. Tip kind of goes there.
He does. That's why he's on this. among other things.
Yeah, it seemed almost unfair to point that out, Tip, but I think we should close up. And unfortunately, there's a cavalcade of questions we won't get to. But I think we were all thinking about your woman and your male and female paintings in this context. And I wondered if you had thoughts about it too.
What context?
Well, Guston's paying much less attention to the women in his life. I mean, there are these paintings Rob writes about, we've talked about some of them, but I guess I find myself agreeing with Amy that it doesn't seem like he was particularly compelled to think outside of his own.
Well, I don't think any man of his generation was. It would have been a very unusual man of that generation to even have that thought, much less figure out how to embed those ideas into the work in addition to everything else. I understand that it's not, to me, the representation of woman in his paintings is probably an accurate reflection of the psychic reality of his life. So I find it fascinating in that way. And I hope that, and I don't really want to talk about my own work in this context, but I guess one hopes that it's an accurate reflection of one's own circumstances. But that can mean a lot of things, and it's for other people to start out, not the person who makes the stuff.
I feel like this is a very unresolved place to leave the conversation, and maybe that's appropriate to Philip Guston. We're way over time. I apologize to the many excellent questions we have scrolling here, but thank you all. It's been a pleasure to hear you think about Guston together. And Rob, thank you so much for this amazing book.
Thank you all for participating in this. It's great.
Okay.
Bye-bye.